Hello, everybody, and welcome to our talk today, where we'll talk about how technology is changing the way we lie to one another and the way we trust one another. My name's Jeff Hancock. I'm a professor of communication at Stanford University, and I'm excited to be sharing with you the research my lab has been doing over the last 2 decades. Certainly, technology has played a big role in the way that we can lie, and there's lots of examples of that. Here's a Snapchat, just a sort of a cute little deception. On the left, you can see it says, "So nice to chill by the pool," and looks like they've got their knees up while they're relaxing somewhere by the pool. But in fact, this person might be just stuck at home in the pandemic, and they've taken a picture of their knuckles in front of a pool on their laptop, just a photo on the laptop. So here's an example of a kind of lie that can be done with technology because we're not in the same place, in the same area. In fact, this is one of the big concerns people have about social media, is that everything is deceptive because it's all overly positive. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive into social media. Deceptions, of course, can be a lot more serious with technology. Amazon, for example, had to sue a large number of both companies and organizations that were using or providing fake reviews. Major concern. It's a concern that most consumers have as well. We all use reviews now when we buy things, and we rely on them as we make decisions about where to allocate our money. So this is a really important topic, and we see deception and technology as a concern for many companies these days. Also, as we think about society and even the very functioning of democracy, there's a lot of worries about how things like bots, for example, which are little computer programs that can impersonate humans, can be used in places like Twitter or on Facebook, other online spaces, to make it sound like the world has one opinion, or that there's a strong grassroots movement, or to spread rumors or false information. And these bots are really prevalent and can play a role in even state actors' deception. So when Russia attacked the 2016 election, they used not only human agents pretending to be Americans, but also bots. And so this is another big kind of deception where it looks like a human, but in fact, it's a machine. And indeed, this is becoming a bigger question all around. When I was agreeing to give this talk, I was emailing with Blair, and Google would allow me to use smart replies. So they would actually write a little reply for me, like, "Sounds good, talk to you then." And so now, even when we're communicating with each other, it's difficult to tell whether it's really me, a human, or in fact some AI. So lots of ways in which deception can make it easier, or where technology can make it easier to lie. And a lot of people, I think, these days have a real concern that we lie more now than we ever have. That this generation is more deceptive, that this era is a more deceptive era than the past. But it's important to know that every generation thinks that the current generation is more deceptive than past generations. So my parents will think that my generation is more deceptive than their parents, and I will think the same thing. In fact, a really nice study going back 5 generations showing that this is a common concern, that we're always worried that we're more deceptive now than we were in the past. And this is a very, very old concern. We can go way back in time. Here we have Diogenes, and some of you who've been taking your classics and doing some history one day classes will know that Diogenes was using that lantern there to search for a single honest man. And of course, the story goes that he died without ever finding one. It's a really uplifting tale. In this period, which is about 500-ish BC, he was representing this concern that Greek society was becoming more deceptive, that there was less honor and less honesty. And so that's well over 2,000 years ago. And it wasn't just a Western concern about this notion of deception. Confucianism, which was starting up around the same time in the East, was also deeply concerned with notions of authenticity, that you didn't just talk the talk, but you walk the walk. And so this notion of being honest, because we're entering this very deceptive era, is always with us humans. And in fact, there's lots of evidence now that this concern with fake news is not a new thing. There's been fake news concerns every time a new technology gets introduced, whether it's newspapers or even the printing press. So, how do we make sense of this then? How do we think about what is actually new and a real problem that we need to deal with? And maybe what are some things about technology that can be really good, that can actually help us with trust and maybe make deception less likely? Well, unlike Diogenes, who started this, over 2,000 years ago, my first sort of professional encounter with deception was as a customs officer in Canada. This is back in the mid 90s. I worked in a maritime station in British Columbia, checking boats that were returning to Canada in BC off the Pacific coast. And you might be thinking that that's a weapon there on my hip, but actually it was just a stamp saying, welcome to Canada. We roll a little bit differently there than in the US. And you can also see behind me a telephone. And this was a new program that had just been implemented. Because British Columbia has a very long coastline, it's difficult to have boats come to just a few manned customs docks. So they created several other docks where you could pull in with your boat, call a phone line, and it would come to my office, and I would interview the person over the phone, and I could actually clear the boats into Canada. And there was concern, obviously, that I wouldn't be able to, look at their eyes or look at their behavior and things like that to see if there was deception. And yet this technology allowed people to clear in, and studies of that process showed that there was no more deception or cheating over the phone than there was face to face, which was a surprise to a lot of people. And we'll go into why that took place. So there's been these questions about how technology is changing the way we lie, even in professional context back in the 90s. My research group has been working on deception, and one of the main things that we want to make sure we start a good grounding with is the definition. There's many different definitions of deception, though they all have these two pieces to them. My philosopher friends can write multiple page-long definitions, but this two-part definition will serve us well for today. It's any intentional attempt to mislead someone. Mislead means I get someone to have a false belief, to believe something that I know not to be true. And it has to be intentional. If Blair had told me, for example, that this started at a different time and she really believed that, then that would just be a mistake. Or I could say something sarcastic like, oh, it sure is great being in a pandemic and not being able to go outside. In that case, I'm saying something that's not true, but I'm not trying to get you to believe something that's false. You can understand my sarcasm, or you can recognize that it was a mistake, those kind of things. So as you think about deception today or going forward, just hold on to those two things. Did you create a false belief in somebody else? And did you do that intentionally? So now that we have that, we can start looking at different kinds of deception. And we've been looking at these different ways that technology has allowed us to lie for almost 2 decades now. And I want to share a couple of kinds with you today. The butler, the sock puppet, and the Chinese 50-cent army. And we'll talk about each of these and how they're related to technology. And we'll start off with the butler lie. If you've ever received this message, on my way, then you've probably been lied to. Almost all the time when somebody says they're on my way, they're about to be on their way, or they're going to be late and they're letting you know. And interestingly, the iPhone, when it first shipped, on my way was one of the default messages, one of the few default messages that shipped with the iPhone. And when we look at them in text messages, it's almost over 80% of the time on my way is not that they're actually on their way. Another one is, sorry, my phone was dead, or I didn't get your message until this morning, those kind of things. When in fact, it wasn't. They just didn't necessarily answer you at that time. And then a common one that can always feel true: got work, gotta go. This one is less deceptive overall, so we often see this in the 30% kind of thing. But typically, these messages were um, managing our communication in this new era where once you have my contact info, you can essentially be in touch with me at any time, almost anywhere. And what these lies are doing are providing a buffer between us and this new world that can reach us almost any time. So, it could be that my friend texted me, and I really like my friend and always, excited to hear from them, but I just didn't want to talk to them right at that moment. Or I was tired of speaking to them. And so I just wanted to do something else. If I was really honest about that, it'd probably be okay, but it'd be a little bit difficult to say. And mostly because I like and respect that person and I like our relationship. So sometimes people opt for these butler lies, which allow me to maintain the relationship, but not have to talk to that person at that moment, or get out of a conversation if I would like to. And so these butler lies are kind of a reaction to a technology change, which is that people can get a hold of me basically 24/7. And so we see these fairly frequently in text messaging for young, college age students that have a lot of social interactions and they're growing a lot of relationships. These can be, up to 20% of all the lies they tell. Um, so they can be a pretty common form of deception. Um, Sock puppets are more about identity. Give you an example. Here's R.J. Ellery, a pretty well-known English author, and his book A Quiet Vendetta. Here's some reviews from Amazon by a person named Nicodemus Jones. Very, very positive reviews. I like the last one there. Whatever else it might do, it will touch your soul. If you want to give reviews to one day about today's talk, you can certainly use that line. And as you are probably guessing, since we're talking about deception, Nicodemus Jones was actually R.J. Ellery, and he was busted by some colleagues that called him out on this. And he would not only praise his own work, he would attack his other author colleagues. And so this is called sock puppetry, where you use technology to mask your identity. So this is a form of identity deception. You're trying to say things that are, positive or negative about something, but you're using a different identity. And this is not new to the internet, of course. Walt Whitman was pretty famous for doing this. When he had a new book of poetry come out, he would send letters all throughout the US to newspapers talking about how great the new Walt Whitman piece was. What is new about sock puppetry on the internet is how easy it is to do, and the fact that it can be done at scale. So very easily we can get a lot of sock puppets to do something for us. The most famous example of this is the Chinese 50-cent army. Here in the US, we call it astroturfing. And the basic idea there is I can pay a lot of people a small amount of money to lie about who they are. And so it would appear that they're, say, part of a grassroots movement and just somebody saying their opinion or their idea, but in fact, they're organized and being paid by some entity that's hiding its deception or its identity. In China, my colleague Jen Pan, who works at Stanford with me, discovered that Chinese government workers, as part of their duties, they are asked to post on social media really positive things about the Chinese party, especially when something controversial is happening. And the idea there is they just want to overwhelm the social media platforms with positivity. And of course, the government workers don't identify themselves as saying, well, I work for the Communist Party, and therefore I think this. Rather, they just say, I'm a citizen of this great country or of this city, and here's why China is so amazing. And it's called 50 cent because they're paid, very small amount as part of their ongoing salary. In the US, this is a huge concern. We have election coming up this year, 2020. One of the things that investigators like the Internet Observatory here at Stanford do is they track these kinds of grassroots organizations that are actually bots or people being paid to do or say things online. And so it's one of the big main challenges. And it's really easy to go from one person lying to many about their identity. One example is the online fake reviews I was telling you about. Instead of just having one or two fake reviews go up, you can pay a company to produce thousands, and usually for relatively low cost. And so this has become one of the really big main problems with deception on the internet. There's even these clickbait farms or troll farms where companies just provide content. So in China, you can see that there are people, organizations that get paid to just literally click on things and to like things and to say things with identities that are fake. And it's one of the main challenges that all the main social media platforms have to deal with. So given those examples of how technology can facilitate deception, it's definitely easy to feel a little discouraged, right? That this new technological era is just ramping up deception. And certainly that's the feeling in the media as well, that there's just so much deception. You can't believe anything. We even have politicians now telling us that we can't believe anything that we read or hear. And I think that's a problem. And I think it's actually not true. And so what I want to do now is share with you some studies that show a different pattern when we think about it in a different way. And what I want you to think about now is we've been talking about technology in general, and that's a little bit of a mistake. And one reason for that is that there are certainly those Nigerian princes that are telling you about a bunch of money that they can give you if you help them out, and there are certainly Russian agents in the U.S. trying to persuade you, but they're part of our unknown network. That is, people that we don't know and we have no relationship with, we have no reputational tie. What I want you to do now is to exclude those folks for a moment and think about the individuals that we talk with the most: our family, our friends, business colleagues, maybe people that we would like to be family, or we would like to be friends, or we would like to be business colleagues. And in that case, the situation with technology and deception is quite different. Let me show you a couple of studies that point out how ultimately, when it's interacting with people that we know or want to know, psychology is going to trump technology pretty much every time. And what I mean by that is the psychological dynamics of whatever the situation is going to be a better predictor of whether and how deception takes place and whether we should trust people than whether or not there's some technology there or not. Now, let me show you. Here's one example of an early study we did that's now been replicated many times. We asked people to record all their lies and all of their social interactions over the main media that they were using. In this case, it was face-to-face, phone, and email. And we would then tally up how many lies they told in a given medium each day. And so now we could say, well, how often did they lie face-to-face? How often did they lie on the phone? And how often did they lie in email? And we would often ask people, how often do you think you lie in which medium? And most people would say, well, I think people lie most on email because there aren't any nonverbal cues. And so because you're behind a screen, you can lie all you want. And we found actually the opposite, that when we recorded people's actual lying and talking behavior, we found that email had the fewest lies in terms of the percentage of communication. And we can calculate that in a couple ways, number of lies per number of emails or phone calls or face-to-face conversations. You can look at it in terms of number of total words spoken. And email ended up being a relatively honest place, lower than the phone, which had the most. Now, some of you are probably a little surprised. Some of you are probably also thinking, well, there might be some reasons for that. And in fact, when I tell you, you'll automatically be like, oh yeah, of course. One big difference between email and the phone is that emails are recorded. Phone calls typically, unless you're told, are not recorded. And a record is a really problematic thing for most deceptions. So an email is a very powerful record because not only do I create a record for myself. I also give a record to the person I'm lying to. There are various servers and companies in between us that have a record. And so my lawyer friends all call email evidence mail. In fact, in New York State, for example, over 50% of all divorce cases, primary evidence is email or text messaging. In fact, if you think back to most political scandals over the last couple decades, it's almost always related to an email or a text message or something that was said online. And it's because we have the records then. Phones, on the other hand, allow us to speak and say things without it being recorded. Another main issue is why people lie. We don't just lie because we can. Most of the time we have a reason. And on the phone, one reason we may need to do that is when I'm talking to people face to face or on the phone, it's in real time. If I pause for even more than about a second, it gets really weird and really awkward. And so when we're talking face to face on the phone, we need to be, talking pretty fast. So sometimes we get into situations where we don't want to lie necessarily, but it's the best option that we have. So if I were to say, hey, Blair, what do you think of my new green shirt? And she hates it, but she also doesn't want to insult me and make me feel bad right before I'm supposed to give a big talk. She might say, well, it looks really nice, Jeff, or I like your haircut. So she didn't want to lie. She didn't plan on lying. She's not lying because she's on the phone. It's in part because she was in a position where the media made a lie the easiest or the best option that she had, given the very fast timing that she had to do. So here we see that when we're talking with people that we know or want to know, we don't see just a huge amount of deception just because technology is involved and I can't see your eyes or whether you look nervous or not. Another study, this wasn't by us, but by some colleagues down in Texas, found that Facebook profiles actually were really reflective of a person's personality. And they did this in a really clever way. We could say, well, we have one guy named Bob, and he's our target. And we're going to get some other people in group A to look at Bob's Facebook profile and look through the things that he's posted over time. And they could spend 4 or 5 minutes reviewing Bob's Facebook profile. And they have another group B, and they actually get to talk to Bob. Okay, so they get to have a conversation with him, interact with him for a short period of time. And then we also have group C, and those are friends of Bob, people that have known Bob for a long time, and they can tell us what his personality is. They've known him, and so we're going to treat their assessment of Bob as ground truth. We say, well, Bob is an extrovert, and he's pretty conscientious, he's low on neuroticism, and he's pretty agreeable. Okay. Now we're interested in, does group A, which has only looked at social media, versus group B, who's talked to Bob, who does better? The amazing thing is, people that looked at social media were just as good as the people that actually talked face to face with Bob. Okay, so why is that a big deal? What it means is that this real deep concern that I hear all the time, that social media and things like Facebook and Instagram aren't real because it's all just overly positive, self-presentation. It's just beautiful pictures, things like that. That it's deceptive, that it doesn't actually reflect who we are. And this study and a number of the followers say, no, that's actually not true. That we, yes, always are trying to present our best selves. Today, for example, I didn't just roll into the video recording wearing my bathrobe and showered and unshaved, although I do have my pandemic beard going. I put on a nice shirt and I combed my hair. We do this every day. This is an important part of being a human. It's called self-presentation. We do this face to face, and we don't think of that as deceptive either. So this suggests that on social media, people are being relatively honest too. Now, does that mean that they're always 100% honest and they're not never using filters and they're not cropping things? Sure, of course people do that. And a lot of times people get called out on it as well. It's very difficult to maintain, as we know, a deception. The more lies we tell, right, the more complex the web we weave. So that's really heartwarming, is that we maybe don't need to be as concerned about deception from people that we know in social media as we thought we did. Here's one other study to give you an example of why the psychology of it matters more than the technology. This is an online dating study that we did in New York City, and we asked online daters to come into the lab for a study. They didn't know it was anything about deception. And the night before they came in, we would record their profile. And what we could do then is when they got in the lab, we could take a bunch of measurements. And we could then compare, like, here's what you said you were like on the online dating site. And here's what you actually are when we measure you. And we got a bunch of measurements: height, weight, their age, income, a bunch of stuff. And what I'm going to show you are some of the key things that we were able to really objectively measure. We can start with height. Here's it is for men. And on the y-axis, the vertical one, that's how tall they were when we measured them in the lab. And on the x-axis, the horizontal one, that's how tall they said they were in their profile. That 45-degree line, that's sort of the 100% truth line. So if their dot is on that line, then they were telling you that that's exactly the height that they actually are. And you can see here that men, most of them, were just a little bit below that line. And what that means is almost all the men were saying that they were taller than they actually were. Almost all of the men did that. Now, it's not a huge amount of lie. On average, it was a little bit less than an inch. In fact, is what my research group calls strong rounding up. So if you're 5'7" and 1/10 of an inch, boom, 5'8". And men always do this. Now, is it the technology making them do that? It's not. In fact, when we go into men's shoe stores and we measure the size of the heel on all the shoes, and we get the average of what an average shoe heel is for men, guess what it is? Just slightly less than an inch. And so even in face-to-face worlds, right, where we're meeting people face-to-face, we tend to exaggerate our height as well. Okay, well, why are they doing that? Are shoes making us lie? Or are the shoemakers doing this to us? No. Some of you are probably guessing why men lie, and you have a good sense of it. It's because people prefer, unfortunately for us shorter guys, taller men. Women, and so these are all heterosexual dating relationships, women prefer taller men. And this finding that we showed has been replicated several times by online dating companies. If you look back to US elections and you look at who won the popular vote, you would be right by basing it just on height about 90% of the time. So, as discouraging as that is, it's not that men are like, oh, all of a sudden I'm online, I can lie about my height. It's that they know that women prefer taller men, and so they're trying to come across as more attractive. All right, now let's take a look at the women. They are very different. Or sorry, let's take a look at women's weight. Women didn't lie very much about their height, is like sort of just what you'd expect. Women lied instead about their weight. So here we have on the vertical axis, we have how much they weighed when we actually weighed them on a scale in the lab. On that horizontal axis is their what they said on their profile. And you can see the women's dots are almost all above the line, and they get more above the line as they get to be heavier. What this is saying is that almost all women lied, saying that they were lighter than they actually were. So the men, they were a very different pattern. Heavy guys, yes, they would lie and say they were a little bit less, but little skinny dudes, they would say they were actually heavier than they were. Whereas women, it was almost all above. Okay, is the technology making them lie? No. Same way for the men, they know that men tend to prefer lighter women. In fact, there's this sort of like hourglass shape that men have been attracted to for centuries. You can look back at poetry and the kinds of women that are lauded, and it's usually this. In our current culture, tend to prefer skinnier women. Now, the women are not just doing these lies just because of technology, but instead it's because they know that men prefer this. And when we talk to some of these women and interview them afterwards, they would even say things like, well, I don't weigh that now, but if I get a date and I'm excited about going on that date, I use it as incentive and motivation to diet down and get to that weight. So one nice thing about weight is, you can imagine moving around. So it might be a lie now, but by the time I meet you, I'll make it true. It's sort of the thinking for some of them. Now, some of you might also be thinking, well, maybe this is just mistakes, right? That they're just inaccurate. They don't know exactly how much they weigh. And if that was the case, and it's certainly true that we don't know, down to the gram or the tenth of an inch how much we weigh. But if that was the case, then the errors would be on both sides of that truth line. But you can see for men in height, it's very systematic, and for women and weight, it's also very systematic. They're either above or below the line, not randomly distributed around it. So again, all of these studies tell us that the psychological factors that are involved are going to be much more predicting how lying takes place than technology. For example, almost none of these lies are really big lies, right? They're all quite small. Why might that be? Well, I want to come across as attractive as possible. I want to say I'm taller than I actually am. And I'm going to say I make more than I do, which men did. But if I do it by so much that when I meet that person, they're like, wow, you lied about your height, then that's game over. One of the worst things to be thought of is as a liar. And so we have to, optimize enough, be attractive enough that we're going to get picked out of the other thousands of dates, but not so much that when I get to coffee, it's going to be the end of the story. Because dating is not about just getting to coffee, but about, either a relationship or about a hookup, right? And so if you lie too much, then that's not feasible. And so again, that's the psychology of it, not the technology. Okay. Well, now I've given you some examples of how technology can actually reduce deception. It can just play a role of allowing us to, present as positively as we can, much like we do face to face. But if that's true, then what about all the trust crisis that's taking place? This is from the Harvard Business Review last summer. And when I give talks to most companies now, that's one of the main things that they're worried about is what's happening now with trust. There's a decline in trust. Trust is changing, and I think that's definitely the case. So what's going on with this trust crisis? Is there an overall, decline in trust? Well, one of the things that is important to remember is that notion of what I call the known network, which are the things I told you about: our friends, our family, our colleagues, people that I want to have a relationship with. It could be that person I'm trying to sell my product to. It could be that women I'm trying to go on a date with. That's our known network. And we tend to not lie more when we're interacting with technology with our known network. In that case, psychology is going to determine more whether we lie or not the technology. But one of the things about the internet and the technologies associated with it, like social media, email, all these other forms, is they allow the unknown network access to us. In a way, Facebook and Google's core business model is to allow people that I don't know to get access to my attention, right? That is what advertising, in a way, is. It's the whole reason that those are multi-hundred billion-dollar companies, is they're allowing unknown network people to come in and get access to my attention. And that group in the unknown network includes legit businesses, for sure. That's the majority of it. It includes legit media enterprises, and includes real journalism. But it also includes that Russian agent. It also includes the Nigerian prince. And it includes a whole host of people trying to make money off of fraud. And that is the real problem. The issue when we talk about just deception and technology in general and the lack of trust is we confuse those two things. And the reason that we confuse them is that we're in some kind of a feed, whether that's a news feed, a Twitter feed, or an email inbox. The known network, those people that I know and care about and I have a reputation and a relationship with, and the unknown network, like Starman 43267, who I don't know, don't care about, and should have no connection with, those get overlapped. And it's sometimes really difficult for me to tell, who's part of this network and who's part of this network. And I read that thing in the San Francisco Chronicle or the Mercury News. That's real journalism and important. But there's also this other thing from the Denver Post, and it looks real. I've never heard of it, but is it real? And can I believe the things that it's saying? And so that's one of the real core problems, is that they get overlapped. And in the unknown network, there is a decent amount of deception. In the known network, deception is not rampant. It's driven more by our relationships and the psychology that we have. But this is the problem: is it overlaps, and we're at a point now in our sort of social evolution where we're still working hard to try to be able to tease apart who's known to us and who's unknown to us. And this gets exacerbated by the next thing I'm going to share with you, which is that not all of the fake news we could talk about, not all the fake news is distributed equally around society. In fact, really, really good work about the 2016 election and how fake news operated just was starting to come out last year and the year before. It takes a while to do really good work at scale. Here's a shocking finding for you. So this is an examination of Twitter. Only 1% of individuals accounted for 80% of fake news source exposures. So that means almost all the fake news that they observed in their study on Twitter was aimed at 1% of the population, which is pretty crazy. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that population is. And it's very worrisome. And here, even more importantly, almost all the fake news was shared by an even smaller percentage of the population. 0.1% shared almost all the fake news. All right, well, who is doing this? Unfortunately, it's older folks. And you might right away think, well, older folks are just, they're not as good at tech, they're dumber, they're more gullible, and you'd be wrong. And it was also people that were more conservative. So conservative and very conservative. Okay, well, conservatives obviously more gullible, whatever. No, that's not it. Liberals and conservatives are equally gullible. Older people and younger people are equally gullible. The problem is that they were targeted. So unfortunately, things related to Trump were able to capture people's attention the most. And so people that wanted to run scams or to make money off of their fake news realized that sending things to older conservatives would be the most likely to get attention, to get that fake news clicked on and shared. And when getting clicked on and shared is how you make money, then you choose things that are going to target populations that are most likely to do that. And so this is a real problem, because now when we talk about fake news, we just talk about it as a general societal problem. Oh my gosh, we have this whole thing. And it's like, actually not. When we take my students in my classes, I get them to go through their news feed for as far back as they can. We spend 10, 15 minutes going through it. And I ask them to identify a single piece of fake news. Not one of them will be able to find it. And oftentimes I have some distinguished guests in my class. It's a little bit older, and sure enough, they will find a piece of fake news. So older folks are being targeted by fake news, and younger people are not. And yet we're sort of like saying this is a problem for the whole, for all of society. Instead, what we need to be doing is providing a lot more resources and help to older folks as they get targeted. In fact, the FBI has their own division dedicated to elder fraud. It's a huge multi-billion-dollar racket. And it's a problem because older folks are also sharing it more often. So you can see here in this graph that if you were over 65, you were 7 times more likely to share fake news if you saw some than people in their 20s. And part of that is digital literacy. They tend not to be as versed in digital worlds. But with training, that effect goes away. My mom, for example, is super good at telling what's fake news and what's not. And it's only because we've talked about different things and this idea of what it is, and resources like, say, Snopes.com. Anytime you see something that is worrying or whatever, then you go and check it out. Older folks have a lot of really important strengths. They have a lot of world experience. They often, once retired, have a lot of time. They actually can dedicate time to doing fact checking once they know how in this sort of new era. They're wealthier than every other generation, so they have a lot of resources. They have a lot of financial resources, which is one of the reasons they're targeted. And they're very civically minded. They're the ones that vote most, right? They're the ones that will get out and volunteer. One of the reasons that they shared fake news a lot was because the fake news was targeting them by causing them to be more anxious. And so they wanted to share it with their family and friends. They take on the kind of role of a shepherd. So, what we want to do, and one of the big programs in the lab now, is to help older adults not only become more resilient to fake news, but actually become the guardians that they're capable of becoming, and actually become our protectors of truth and helping to reduce all of this fake news. So, although people are quite pessimistic about a lot of these kinds of things, and there's some reason to be, the kinds of state hostile state actors like Russia, some of the programs that they're putting together are very sophisticated. The good news is that on our side, we're learning as well, and I think with time and with education, we'll be able to make these folks that much more stronger and powerful. So, when you hear that worry about fake news, take it with a grain of salt. Understand that it is an important issue. But for most people, most of the time, I'm talking like over 95% of the time, the news that they're reading is real. And if we stop believing in news, then that's the real problem, is when we stop having faith in legit news organizations that are actually doing professional journalistic practices. So that's a really core thing that I want to make sure everybody holds on to. And it's not just everybody that's getting targeted, but rather a particular demographic that we need to make sure we help. All right, now those are some real issues for us: the unknown network getting mixed in with the known network, the demographics. So we can turn now to how do we go about detecting this kind of stuff? And there's been about 60 years now of social science, so psychology, communication, um, economics, that's been working on how we detect deception. And there's been a lot of like summaries of these studies. And so what I thought I would do now is give you a little bit of a primer or a real crash course on the latest that we know about how to detect deception, and then how you can take those ideas and apply them to technology. So how can we tell if somebody is lying? Let's talk about what we know for face to face first, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can think about, what's trustworthy and what's not online. So the first things I'm going to tell you are some things that took me a while to kind of come to believe, because there's a number of things that are really powerfully ingrained kind of myths about deception detection. So the first is that we have a truth bias. In fact, there's only one finding that gets replicated in every single deception detection study, and that's that we believe each other. And so we believe each other in this very fundamental way that most of the time, if you say something, I'm going to believe it, unless I get moved into some sort of suspicious state. The next is that there is actually no cue to deception that will always tell you. We've got verbal, so what we say, there's nonverbal, there's physiological, but actually there is no Pinocchio's nose. There is no one cue that will always tell us whether somebody's lying. Hard to believe, but I tell you, I've spent decades working on this, and I'm afraid it's true. We're pretty bad at just telling if somebody's lying by just judging the message. So if I said two things to you, which I'm about to show you and give you an example, you'll have a hard time choosing between them. So for example, and let me show you this. Okay, I have to do it in a little bit of a different order. We can't tell typically if people are lying. We end up using other kinds of information to do that. And one of the big changes that technology has done to deception detection is that record. So there's been probably 100 billion people or so that have lived since we've been talking to each other. And those 100 billion people have evolved communication for us. And that communication disappeared whenever they said it. So until about 5,000 years ago, when there was the first writing ever, every single thing that every one of those 100 billion people said disappeared, totally evanescent, gone. So when they lied, it was gone. And even until very recently, like the printing press, um, almost every person said stuff that just disappeared. Nobody was literate, very tiny portions of the population. In fact, it's not until World War II that half of the population was literate. So most people, for most of our evolution, have communicated in a way in which everything they say disappeared. Now, in the networked age, by the time you hear this talk today, you will have written something. You'll have written in this audience more than all of human prehistory. So what that means is we're leaving records. And that is changing, I think, the way we can detect deception. Here's some examples of fake reviews. Here's two of them. One of them is real, we got from hotels.com. One of them is fake, we bought it. We paid $1 to an online worker to write a fake review for the James Hotel. Now, you can come back to this and you can take a look at this as much as you like and try and decide which one is fake. You would rely on certain kinds of cues that you think are important to you, and some of you will be right. But if we were to run this as a test, we would find that you would perform at 50-50. Now, the actual fake one is B. And there are some things in here, like it tends to be overly positive. They tend to talk about who they were there and what they were doing and who they were there with, rather than actually about the hotel and its shape and size. And that's important. You can see that they're much more positive than the A, and they talk less about what it was like there and where it was located. That's because they're making things up. So one really cool thing about deception online is there's a record of it. It allows you to use some other resources like checking other reviews, checking the website, doing other kinds of things that allow you to detect deception. Just like if you remember Columbo, he wouldn't just trust what you said. He would ask questions of other people and check to see if what you said made sense with them. That's what we can do now online all the time. Instead of looking at like whether somebody's lying or not, what we actually do is we look at trustworthiness. So here's a peacock and he's got all these amazing feathers, and it's not to look pretty, it's actually to convince peahens that he's a trustworthy peacock. And trustworthy in the biological world means I've got good genes. We do this too, it turns out. Now, if I were to show you these two guys that and get you to say which one is more trustworthy, instead of it being 50-50, almost all of you would say B. And the reason for that is he's got like nice eyes, right? They're soft. He's got a shorter forehead, upturned mouth, rounder face. It's a baby face. And we trust that. It gives off the trustworthiness. Now, does that mean that B is actually more trustworthy? Absolutely not. These aren't even real people. They're made up. Even though they're made up, we can very quickly decide which one we would trust or not. And so if you're interested in switching from trying to detect deception to understanding what's trustworthy, I really recommend this book by Tim Levine. Great guy, one of my favorite scholars of deception. This book's fantastic. Malcolm Gladwell's new book is based off of the work in here, and he has some really nice podcasts on that if you prefer to take it easier than diving into this big book. And so to conclude, instead of thinking about deception, let's think about trust. How do we signal trust? Well, trust is based on competence. So can that person do what they say they're gonna do? It's based on honesty. Do they do what they say they're gonna do? And it's on reliability. Do they do it when they say they're going to do it? And really, the bottom line, and usually for academics, it's always way more complicated, but here there's just three things. And that's how you can judge whether other people are trustworthy, whether it's online or not. And it's how you can also be sure that you're being trustworthy, is by being able to do what you say you're gonna do, doing what you say you're going to do, and doing it when you're going to do it. And thanks very much for your attention.